I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. Blade Runner wasn't just a sci-fi movie. It was a brutal clash of egos, rain machines, and artistic visions colliding in the dark. Behind the neon glow, the production nearly collapsed. Crew mutinies, studio sabotage, and on-set misery haunted every frame. What audiences didn't know was that chaos off-camera was just as intense as the dystopia on screen. Actors clashed with the director. Sets flooded from endless water rigs. Executives threatened to tear the movie apart. So today, we're peeling back the shadows. Here are 20 weird facts about Blade Runner, the movie that defined a rain-soaked future. Stay until the bonus fact, because it involves a secret detail even die-hard fans missed. Let's dive into the storm. Hit play, and let's go. Harrison Ford versus Ridley Scott. The set war. It wasn't just artistic tension, it was open hostility. Harrison Ford, fresh off Raiders of the Lost Ark, walked into Blade Runner expecting a collaborative experience. Instead, he found a director in Ridley Scott who demanded absolute control and micromanaged every gesture. Ford felt stripped of creative input. What audiences didn't see was the silent war brewing. Ford later admitted, "It was a nightmare. It was a clash of cultures." Crew members recall him storming off set after endless retakes, visibly frustrated. Ridley, known for his perfectionism, believed every shadow, every pause, had to match his vision of noir futurism. The atmosphere became so toxic that communication broke down. Scott gave notes through intermediaries, and Ford delivered performances laced with suppressed resentment. Ironically, that hostility bled into Deckard's weary, bitter demeanor, making the character eerily authentic. The conflict didn't just shape the movie, it became the movie. The crew's infamous T-shirt mutiny. Not everyone hated Ridley quietly. Some rebelled with cotton. The American crew grew tired of his aloof, British schoolmaster directing style. They accused him of ignoring them while praising his UK colleagues. The resentment boiled over into a silent protest, known as the T-shirt mutiny. Crew members arrived on set wearing shirts that read, "Yes, Governor, my ass," and "Will Rogers never met Ridley Scott." It was a direct jab at Scott's alleged arrogance. For a film drowning in rain machines and smoke, this mockery broke through like lightning. Scott didn't flinch. He kept directing, even as the shirts mocked him. But the tension was undeniable. The incident symbolized the cultural clash between Hollywood crews and British auteurs. Not rebellion, but humiliation. And yet those shirts captured the production's true climate. Stormy, bitter, unforgettable. Endless rain, endless misery. The rain wasn't an effect. It was torture. Ridley Scott insisted Los Angeles 2019 must always look drenched, so he ordered massive rain rigs that poured down day and night. Actors were soaked, shivering, and miserable. Crew members described working in freezing waterlogged clothes, their boots filling with mud. Sean Young, who played Rachel, later said she dreaded stepping onto set. Hair, makeup, wardrobe, constantly ruined by cascading water. Every scene required painstaking resets. The rain machines delayed production and inflated costs. But Scott refused to compromise. His vision demanded it. What audiences didn't realize that suffocating dampness created real exhaustion, amplifying the weary look of every character. It wasn't acting, it was survival. Blade Runner's eternal rain wasn't just atmosphere. It was a production punishment that soaked everyone in frustration. Rutger Hauer's legendary improvisation. The most quoted line in Blade Runner wasn't scripted. Rutger Hauer, playing Roy Batty, rewrote his own death monologue the night before filming. He slashed through the overwritten draft and scribbled something leaner, more poetic. The next day, under pouring rain, he delivered, "All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain." Ridley Scott later admitted he was stunned. The line distilled the essence of the film: mortality, memory, loss. better than any page of script. Hauer's instinct turned a good scene into cinematic immortality, not just improvisation, a farewell gift. Hauer gave Batty humanity in his final breath. That one moment transformed a villain into a tragic hero. What audiences didn't know was that this wasn't a director's triumph. It was an actor's genius, carved in the storm. The studio's butchered cuts. What you saw in theaters wasn't Ridley Scott's vision. It was a studio Frankenstein. Warner Brothers executives hated the bleak ambiguity of his cut, fearing audiences would reject it. So they meddled, adding clunky voiceovers from Harrison Ford and slapping on a forced happy ending with stolen shining footage. Ford despised the narration. He reportedly recorded it half-heartedly, hoping the studio wouldn't use it. But they did. Critics panned the theatrical cut as disjointed and flat. Only years later did Scott restore his vision in the director's cut and final cut. Not triumph, but sabotage. Yet the multiple versions became part of the film's legacy, sparking decades of debate. What is real Blade Runner? The one with Ford's tired monologues, or the one where silence speaks louder than words? Sean Young's struggles on set. Sean Young was only 22 when cast as Rachel, the elegant replicant. She expected glamour, but found hostility. Crew members considered her inexperienced, and Harrison Ford reportedly dismissed her, refusing to rehearse. In one infamous scene where Deckard forces himself on Rachel, Young said she felt humiliated both as a character and as an actress. Ridley Scott insisted on the aggressive direction, framing it as noir intensity, but audiences later criticized the sequence as unsettling. Young later claimed that she felt isolated and unwelcome throughout the shoot. Ironically, that same coldness fed into her performance, giving Rachel the exact aura of vulnerability and restraint Scott wanted. Not collaboration, but cruelty. The production environment shaped her performance, making her haunting presence unforgettable, even though the cost was a young actress bearing the brunt of tension and discomfort. Deckard's drinking wasn't always acting in Blade Runner. Harrison Ford's Deckard often seems weary, cynical, and perpetually half-drunk. What audiences didn't know is that some of that might not have been performance. Crew members later recalled Ford occasionally drinking between takes, frustrated by Scott's endless retakes and studio meddling. Long hours, freezing rain, and creative clashes wore him down. The result? Ford's sluggish, sardonic delivery became part of the character. He played a man drowning in exhaustion because, in truth, he was. Ridley Scott didn't discourage this. He thought it added authenticity. Ford himself admitted later that he felt trapped in a film he didn't fully believe in. Not polished method acting, but a byproduct of real irritation. Ironically, that rawness cemented Deckard as one of the most human noir protagonists in sci-fi cinema. His exhaustion wasn't crafted, it was lived. The unicorn dream was last minute. The most debated scene in Blade Runner, Deckard's unicorn dream, wasn't in the original script. Ridley Scott inserted it late in production, hinting at the possibility that Deckard himself might be a replicant. The unicorn footage was actually outtake material from Legend, another Scott fantasy epic. Scott spliced it in, confusing studio executives and enraging some crew who felt the movie didn't need added ambiguity. But that one surreal insert changed everything. It wasn't just a dream sequence. It became the cornerstone of decades-long debates. Is Deckard human or machine? Critics and fans still argue, with Scott doubling down in later interviews while Harrison Ford insists Deckard is human. Not clarity, but mystery. And that mystery made the film eternal, turning a noir detective story into a philosophical riddle about identity, perception, and what it means to be alive. Brutal working hours. Nearly broke the crew, Blade Runner was shot mostly at night, with endless rain machines and smoke filling the Warner Bros. Backlot. Crews endured grueling 14-hour shifts, finishing at dawn only to return a few hours later. Fatigue turned to open resentment. Crew members described being sick from the artificial atmosphere, smoke, damp clothing, and exhaustion eroded morale. Ridley Scott demanded meticulous perfection, even as conditions worsened. Some called it a war of attrition. The toll was so brutal that the set earned the nickname Blood Runner. But here's the twist: those oppressive conditions bled directly into the film. The tired, irritable faces of extras, the lethargy in Ford's movements, the bleakness in atmosphere weren't staged. They were reality. Not simulated dystopia, but lived dystopia. The exhaustion baked into the movie's DNA made Blade Runner feel like a world where no one can escape despair. Harrison Ford hated the voiceover. One of the most infamous aspects of Blade Runner's theatrical release was the clunky narration forced by Warner Brothers executives. Ford despised it. He later said, "They didn't hire me to be a narrator, they hired me to be an actor." During recording, he reportedly delivered lines in a deliberately flat tone, hoping the studio would scrap it. They didn't. Critics panned the theatrical version for sucking mystery out of the story, spoon-feeding audiences instead of letting them wonder. Ironically, the hated narration turned into cult trivia, a reminder of how studio interference can warp art. Ford never forgave the decision, and fans still debate whether his monotone was sabotage or just exhaustion. And here's where we pause. Go ahead and like and subscribe, because the next 10 facts dig even deeper into the chaos, genius, and storms that defined Blade Runner. The Tyrell Corporation set nearly cooked everyone. The massive Tyrell Corporation interiors were shot on Warner Bros.' Stage 25, using gigantic lights to create the glowing pyramid atmosphere. But those lights generated staggering heat. Cast and crew sweltered under heavy costumes while smoke machines choked the air. Sean Young fainted during one session, and extras begged for breaks. Ridley Scott refused to compromise. He believed the oppressive heat added to the otherworldly feel. What audiences didn't realize was that the golden glow came at a brutal cost. Working conditions felt closer to an industrial furnace than a movie set. Crew members remembered sweat dripping onto equipment, shorting cables, and tempers flaring. Not controlled artistry, but survival. Yet that unbearable intensity translated into eerie majesty on screen, turning the Tyrell Pyramid into one of sci-fi's most iconic sets. The suffering baked into the walls is still visible in every glowing frame. The spinner car was a nightmare machine. The futuristic spinner flying cars looked dazzling, but behind the scenes, they were barely functional nightmares. Built from fiberglass and steel with experimental hydraulics, the spinner prototypes often broke down mid-scene. Crew members had to push or tow them across set, ruining schedules. Harrison Ford hated climbing in and out because the cramped cockpits trapped heat and smelled of oil. Special effects teams scrambled constantly to fix leaks, sparks, or jammed doors. What audiences didn't know, most of the spinner flying sequences weren't full vehicles, but models on rigs, filmed painstakingly in miniature. The ground-level cars were almost props in disguise, looking futuristic but running on fumes. Not slick futuristic transport, but lumbering headaches. Still, their clunky design ended up adding authenticity, suggesting a future where even high-tech machines still break down and frustrate their weary operators. Daryl Hannah's stunt left her injured. Daryl Hannah, playing Pris, trained in gymnastics for her role, eager to perform her own stunts. But one rehearsal turned disastrous. While running from a trailer, she slipped on the pavement and shattered her elbow. Production halted while she recovered, and her arm had to be hidden on camera for several weeks. The accident only deepened the sense of chaos on set, already plagued by rain, smoke, and endless retakes. Hannah's injury didn't stop her. She returned determined, and her acrobatic fight with Deckard became one of the film's most unforgettable moments. Not staged elegance, but real pain. Her resilience fed into Pris's feral energy, making her seem even more dangerous and unpredictable. What audiences didn't realize behind that terrifying doll-like exterior was an actress fighting through injury to give everything she had to the role. Edward James Olmos invented his own language. As Gaff, the origami-making officer, Edward James Olmos decided his character needed a hybrid future dialect. Instead of sticking to the script, he researched and stitched together city speak, a mixture of Hungarian, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, and German. He rehearsed lines phonetically, creating a futuristic street patois that baffled cast and crew. Ridley Scott loved it, believing it made the world richer and stranger. The studio wasn't so sure. They feared audiences wouldn't understand. But Olmos insisted, saying, "By 2019, this is how people will talk." Not generic future speak, but lived imagination. His invention became one of the film's most haunting details. Gaff's few lines carried the weight of a melting pot dystopia, showing a future where cultures collide and merge into something alien yet believable. What audiences didn't realize was that this was actor-driven world-building at its purest. The dailies nearly drove Scott mad. Every night, Ridley Scott reviewed the dailies, raw footage from the day's shoot. Instead of relief, he found despair. Endless takes, ruined by rain, smoke, or faulty props, filled the reels. Warner Brothers executives hovered, criticizing costs and delays. Scott was battling both his crew and his financiers in real time. The stress was crushing. At one point, insiders recalled him watching dailies alone, chain-smoking, muttering that he feared the movie would collapse. What audiences didn't know, Blade Runner looked like a disaster during production. Sluggish pacing, drenched sets, and miscommunication painted a picture of failure, not confidence, but dread. And yet, in those dark dailies, the seeds of a masterpiece were forming. The imperfections fused into atmosphere. Scott's obsession pushed through chaos, turning near failure into cinematic legend. Every frame that nearly broke him now defined science fiction history. The Zora death scene was botched. Joanna Cassidy, who played Zora, was supposed to die crashing through multiple glass panes in a rain-soaked chase. But on the day, Scott used a stunt double in a bad wig and ill-fitting costume. The result? A scene that looked awkward, with fans instantly noticing the double's face. Critics even mocked it in reviews. Years later, Cassidy returned to reshoot the sequence with digital technology for the 2007 final cut. She finally gave her character the send-off it deserved, crashing through glass in seamless slow motion. Not slick in 1982, but jarring. Yet the mistake became part of the legend, symbolizing how even visionary films can falter under budget and scheduling constraints. The reworked scene restored dignity to Zora and proved that Blade Runner wasn't frozen in time. It was still evolving decades after release. Real streets, not sci-fi backlots. Although Blade Runner feels like it was filmed in a fully constructed future city, much of it was repurposed from existing Los Angeles architecture. The famous Bradbury Building, used for J.F. Sebastian's home, was a century-old office building. Scott transformed it with smoke, neon and rain, turning it into a decaying futuristic labyrinth. Outside, Warner Bros.' New York Street backlot was retrofitted with Japanese neon and clutter, creating the iconic Rain City look. The trick wasn't invention, it was reinvention. Not alien architecture, but haunted familiarity. Scott believed a real city needed to feel layered, like history piled on itself. That choice gave the film its eerie plausibility. What audiences didn't know, those future alleys were real places, breathing with history. By bending the present into a nightmare future, Scott created a city that felt both familiar and terrifyingly prophetic. Vangelis scored in chaos. The film's haunting electronic score, composed by Vangelis, wasn't created under peaceful studio conditions. Vangelis worked in a smoke-filled studio, improvising long synth passages, while Scott hovered with notes. But Warner Bros. Executives clashed with him, demanding more conventional cues. At one point, Vangelis threatened to walk away, furious over interference. The soundtrack nearly didn't happen, and yet those improvisations created one of cinema's most unforgettable soundscapes, haunting, mournful, dreamlike. What audiences didn't realize is that the music wasn't fully released until years later. The original soundtrack album withheld many key pieces, frustrating fans. Only decades later did full recordings emerge, revealing how much richness had been hidden, not orderly composition, but chaotic creation. That chaos gave Blade Runner its soul. The score didn't just accompany the visuals, it bled into the film's DNA, amplifying its lonely, rain-soaked melancholy. The film flopped at release today. Blade Runner is hailed as a masterpiece, but in 1982, it crashed. Released just weeks after E.T. and Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, it was seen as too slow, too dark, too strange. Critics complained about pacing and called it style over substance. The box office limped, and Warner Brothers considered it a failure. Harrison Ford's star power couldn't save it, and Ridley Scott's reputation took a hit. But slowly, VHS and midnight screenings turned the tide. Fans obsessed over details, theories, and atmosphere. By the 1990s, it had been reborn as a cult classic and then canonized as one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made. Not instant success, but resurrection. Its failure gave way to immortality. What audiences dismissed in 1982 became the blueprint for dystopian cinema for generations to come. Critics initially missed the philosophy. When Blade Runner opened, reviewers focused on the visuals but often ignored its deeper themes. Few acknowledged its questions about humanity, identity, and artificial life. It wasn't until years later that scholars embraced it as cyberpunk's defining text. The idea of replicants questioning their existence resonated in an age of biotechnology and digital futures. At release, it was confusing. Decades later, it became prophetic. Not shallow visuals, but layered allegory. Ridley Scott's rain-soaked Los Angeles spoke to globalization, urban decay, and corporate domination before these became mainstream anxieties. Today it's studied in philosophy courses and cited by futurists. What critics failed to grasp in 1982 now feels chillingly accurate. Blade Runner didn't just predict the future, it warned us about it. The fact that its wisdom was missed at first only deepened its mythic, enduring power. Bonus fact, the hidden origami cameo. Here's the kicker. One of Blade Runner's most enduring mysteries, the origami left by Gaff was never scripted in detail. Edward James Olmos secretly folded dozens of figures between takes, leaving them around the set as his personal signature. Scott loved the idea and wove it into the film's fabric. That unicorn origami wasn't just a prop. It was an improvised gesture that cemented the Deckard as replicant theory. Fans spent decades debating its meaning, but the truth is, it was born from one actor's hobby, not carefully planned symbolism, but spontaneous creation. Yet that tiny fold of paper became the film's most haunting clue, proof that even the smallest improvisations can reshape cinematic history.